Hello everybody. They're like buses, these Lotus. You spend ages without driving a single one, and then two great ones come along at once. I've only just got out of the beautiful Series 1 Elise, and now I'm jumping into this 1989 Esprit Turbo SE. I think it's fair to say that the Lotus Turbo Esprit is my Eleanor. And note there that I say the Turbo Esprit is my Eleanor, not the Esprit Turbo. Midway through the car's life cycle, Lotus did decide to switch the two around. The early Giugiaro wedge-shaped turbos are just one of my dream cars, and I've come ever so close to ownership on a number of occasions, but I've always just backed out at the last minute. Usually because I've been afraid of the potentially ruinous ownership costs, and I've never felt that I've had the sort of financial support that I would need to keep one on the road, and I would hate to have a beautiful Lotus and just look at it being broken. I've driven later Esprits. I've driven a very, very late V8, and I've driven Charlie Douglas's very nice S4. But this car is the oldest Esprit I've driven. Now, it's fair to say that I've never really been a big fan of the Stevens-bodied cars, but this one in this beautiful bright red is quite a striking thing. In fact, if ever there were a case of the Lotus as a Ferrari alternative, this would be it. And I say Ferrari alternative and not cut price Ferrari because, well, when these came out, you wouldn't really save much money by buying one of these in place of a Ferrari. When the first Turbo Esprit came out, they were priced pretty much the same as a 308, which would have been the equivalent V8 Ferrari of the time. Now, as time went by, the Esprit did grow in price a little bit, but nowhere near as much as the Ferrari. So by the time the final Esprit was in production, it was about £60,000 versus the sort of 100 plus grand you'd need to pay out for a Ferrari 360. The SE is notable for being the first Esprit to be charge-cooled. Lotus have a fondness for charge cooling, it seems, and if you're unfamiliar with what that means, go and Google it. Now, the last time I drove an Esprit, I remember it being quite an intimidating thing. It's a big, wide, low car, and you can't really see much of the front at all from the driver's seat. And all you can really see is the vents from the front there. That's about it. It's not an easy car to place on a road, certainly not after you've just jumped out of a Series 1 Elise, which is possibly one of the easiest cars to drive down a tight, narrow country lane. However, once you're at speed, this is a very pleasant car to move along in. The gearbox is definitely an Achilles heel of this car. It moves at its own pace, and if you don't do exactly what it wants you to, when it wants you to, it has no tolerance. The interior of this thing is just this beautiful combination of very high quality leather, very cheap switches, this amazing old-fashioned instrument binnacle which really wraps around you and lasted until about 1998. I quite like it, I think much more so than the more modern design that came in the Esprit GT3. These older cars are a 2.2 litre Lotus designed engine. Off boost, the car's got, unsurprisingly, very little to give. The car has something of a primitive overboost function in it. Apparently, when the car is happy to do so, it will give you up to about half a bar of extra boost over normal. This brings the power up to about 280 over the regular 260 horses. However, the charge cooler can heat soak itself, and so for the most part it won't do that. What's really remarkable about the Esprit is having just jumped out of a Series 1 Elise, without a doubt one of the greatest driver's cars of all time, this thing is still a real pleasure to hustle along. Now, you can't treat it the same way as you can an Elise. You simply can't beat on it in the same way. It's just not going to tolerate it whatsoever, and quite frankly it just feels a little bit cruel trying to do that to a 30-year-old car. Now, I myself may look a little bit flustered because, believe it or not, up here in Scotland it's actually blissfully sunny. I've got the window down for one simple reason. It's ruddy hot, this car has black leather inside it, and air conditioning which presently does not work. Every time I meet somebody that owns an Esprit, I'm hoping they'll be the person that tries to convince me that they're nowhere near as unreliable as people say. Unfortunately, I simply can't say that with this car. It's been in its owner's possession for quite a few years, and in that time he hasn't really seen it that much, so I'm particularly grateful to him for lending it to me today, and it's actually, well, behaving itself. Touch wood, because I don't want to invite disaster. Ah, there we go.
Nice one.
Great. For those interested more in the numbers, I'll put those up on screen now so you can peruse this car's vital statistics. It's not particularly amazing in any direction. It's not especially lightweight compared to earlier Esprits, nor is it especially powerful compared to later ones. But it is actually very nice to drive. It turns in pretty happily. It's also very comfortable in that way that only old school supercars can be. Once upon a time, this was probably considered a fairly firm car, but Lotus have always had this ability to make cars that handle brilliantly without beating the living daylights out of their drivers. When you're at speed, you basically can't hear the engine at all, which is fine because these four-cylinder units just don't sound that great. The naturally aspirated 4-pot, which is a close relation of this in my XL, actually sounded pretty tasty when you're on the move, but this thing's just a bit, I've heard some Esprits which just sound louder, but you're never going to get a 4-cylinder turbo Esprit or Esprit Turbo to sound great. And I'm actually genuinely looking forward to doing the drive-bys with this car because it's such a pretty looking thing, such a sleek, simple shape. Although much like the Series 1 Elise, it's not a shape that I particularly like. It's one that I can understand and admire. You've got to keep the engine in its happy place. Throttle pedal is long, there's a reasonable bit of turbo lag, but it comes in smoothly enough and it doesn't have the savage punch that you get from a modern turbocharged car, so you can still make decent progress. It is in fact a car very well suited to these roads, and it's not slow. It's really not. Once it picks up and it starts revving, very old school turbo. It does its work later on in the rev range. Reminds me a little bit of my Subaru, which is my reference point for good old school turbocharged cars. The steering is so feelsome, no power steering in this generation of Esprit. They did get it later on. You actually can place it with some accuracy once you get used to the size of it. The brake pedal is actually very responsive and does precisely what you tell it to, but again, you have to remember the fact these are 30-year-old brakes. They aren't going to stop a car as well as modern brakes would, but it works nicely. You get into a rhythm with it. In fact, the last Lotus that I drove from this period would be the Carlton, and in many ways I can see the resemblance. It's not the sharpest thing ever, not by modern standards, but there's a rhythm to it, there's a comfort to it, it's got performance, and you know what? This does feel properly special. I talk about supercars a lot, and although by modern standards this wouldn't even cut the mustard as a sports car in performance terms, it's the experience that sets it apart. That view out the back of that nice rear wing, which I do actually quite like, those air scoops in the side, the shape of it, the drama, this crazy interior, all these beautiful materials everywhere. This is a proper Lotus, and it's a proper old school supercar. I still would never own one for the exact same reason I would never own the Series 1 Elise. It's just not the shape for me. I can't wait for the day that I drive a Giugiaro Turbo Esprit, and I worry because if it's rubbish, well, it'll be like meeting your hero and finding out he's a bit of a dick. But if it's great, I want one even more. And I'm not going to try and kid myself into thinking that owning an Esprit, certainly not an older one, is going to be an easy experience. But if that old car drives even a little bit like this, part of me kind of thinks it would be worth it. And at the very least, even if it is broken and it's sat in my driveway, it'd be a pretty nice thing to look at. This is a cool car. Anyway, I hope you guys are enjoying this continued series up here in Scotland. Sorry that I look a little bit flustered, but it's been a wonderful day. But I've been running around these hills and everything, and it's just a touch warm. I promise, this is not special effects. It's really sunny in Scotland. Anyway, thank you all for watching. Thanks very much to this car's kind owner for bringing it up. Please like, comment below, subscribe if you haven't already. We'll see you all for the next one. Bye bye.